Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Anne Arundel Bird Club's Community Lecture Series. My name is Chris Eberly. I'm president of the Anne Arundel Bird Club. Personally, I think we're going to have a really interesting, fun talk tonight. When you look at the title that's showing there about tonight's presentation, you might be thinking it's a head scratcher. But I think the information that is being presented tonight will help you stop scratching your head. Dr. Sonja Kolstoe is an environmental economist who specializes in valuing environmental goods and services. Non-market valuation is another way to say. And she focuses primarily on the human dimensions of wildlife and outdoor recreation to include birds and bird watching. She received her doctoral degree from the University of Oregon in 2016, and prior to her current position as a research economist for the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, she was a member of the faculty at Salisbury University uh, for 4.5 years. She maintains affiliate appointments with both Salisbury University and the University of Oregon, which is in Eugene. A persistent theme throughout her work is the exploration of novel and large data sources, such as citizen community science data sources like eBird and satellite data, and how they can be combined with traditional data sets such as survey data to overcome previous data limitations. Dr. Kolstoe did maybe a shortened version of this presentation back in October. Same types of material at the Maryland Bird Day Live event celebrating Migratory Bird Day. So I'm looking forward to hopefully getting into a little more in depth with discussions tonight. Sonja, take it away, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to both Chris and Pamela for the invitation to come talk to all of you this evening. I really do enjoy talking to the public about my work, but also providing an opportunity for people to become more informed about how and why economists value environmental goods and services, and why I have chosen to focus on bird biodiversity within that segment. And so I have recently changed affiliations. And so now I'm working full-time within, ironically, hopefully you'll appreciate this, the Good Services and Values program, which is one of the 5 programs out of the Pacific Northwest Station. I want to first give you guys an overview of what we'll talk about tonight, and some of these things will parallel what I talked about during the Lunch and Learn during the Maryland Bird Day Live. But I also want to take this opportunity to educate, because after all, I don't think the educator ever leaves any of us once we've been one, to help you understand how these models work that I use to go about valuing bird watching to birds to bird watchers. And so first I want to, of course, motivate why this all matters, why you should care, right? After all, we all want to know, like, why should we care? That's always something that comes up. So let me start off by that at the beginning of my talk, and then we'll move into how and why we value environmental goods and services, go through different examples of ecosystem services, especially this is one of the things you may not actually realize, is that the Forest Service has a planning rule that was put into place in 2012 that actually categorizes different kinds of ecosystem services we're charged with valuing. And we'll actually talk about some of the techniques used to value environmental goods and services, i.e. non-market goods, because they're not bought and sold in the marketplace, and then actually break it down into the different parts that make up the total economic value. Then we'll move into the second segment, which is our latter half of the talk, which is really going to get into what I have focused a large part of my work on, which is recreation demand as it relates to bird watching. So what you all do for fun, as I do as well, for this, to help you better understand how this all actually relates to what policymakers want to know when it comes to making policies, making rules, and regulations. So I think this is why I hope you find this as informative as I hope you will find it. Okay, let's click. Maybe, there we go. First off, when we start to think about ecosystem services, we should have a reference point. So what do we mean? Well, there's things that we enjoy about environmental goods and services that actually provide us with something, right? There's the kind of obvious thing that all of us can relate to, which is the human enjoyment of environmental goods and services. In this case, when we are bird watching at home or away from home. We also recognize that, hey, birds are effective pest controls, right? They're also pollinators. So we can also think about how they disperse seeds, they're scavengers, and they help cycle nutrients in our ecosystems. So these are just some of the examples that relate to what birds do and what kind of ecosystem services birds provide us. Later on, when I talk about the 2012 planning rule that the Forest Service has, we'll go into a greater depth about the different types of examples that are outside of birds. One of the things I also want to bring up is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they do a quinquennial survey on fishing, hunting, and wildlife watching every 5 years, right, quinquennial. And so the most recent one was done in 2016. The information gets published a bit later, so 2018 is typically when the report, so about 2 years after, so in this case 2018 when the report came out. And in 2016, 45.1 million people went bird watching in some form or fashion, whether it was within a mile of their home. So the majority of folks, when they observe birds, not too surprising, is within a mile of their home. So we're talking 38.7 million there. And then about just over a third, 36%, traveled more than a mile away from home to go bird watching, right? And so this is where you're going to realize that the methods we're going to talk about tonight are going to focus on this 36%. And so this is actually why some of the work that I'm doing now actually matters, because it's going to get at that 86%. I don't have that up, but if you want to talk to me more about the work that I have about valuing backyard bird watching in the Chesapeake, I'm happy to go into that during the comments time. One of the things that comes to mind is that many of you may have heard in the news or read this article that came out in the fall of 2019 that was published by a team out of Cornell, Rosenberg and all, about using Audubon data, so the Christmas bird count, but also eBird and other data sets to figure out what's happened to bird populations over time. And they found that we've lost actually about 30% of birds in North America since 1970, right? So this is a pretty dramatic thing. And we also realize that that means we're losing some of those ecosystem services that birds provide us with, right? So if we don't have a way to measure this, right, how do you put this into context? We can see that number is large, again, but we don't necessarily relate it to what it means without this kind of transcription, if you will, or mapping, crosswalk of what losing these bird populations mean to people. And so this is why understanding the role they play in our society, so that when there are changes, again, it could be populations improving, right? We always hope that the restoration efforts we do are going to help support bird populations so that they can rebound. We always hope for that, but we also recognize that sometimes there are declines on populations, and so it goes both ways. And we need our methods then be able to account for both improvement and degradations in environmental quality. And so when it comes to my work, right, well, again, as Chris mentioned in the intro, right, so I have citizen science data that I'm using, there's survey data I use, there's also GIS and remote sensing, and as well as administrative data. So you might ask yourself, why do I use these latter two categories, right? The GIS, remote sensing data, and administrative data. Well, this is to have better information on the people to augment what's given by eBird and the survey data, right? Especially if you're trying to make it representative of the general population, you need to have information on the general population itself, not just your sample, right? To put this into context. And so that's why these data sources come into play. So then we think about what are the different kinds of things that I do. Well, I do everything from hiking and wildfires, avian biodiversity, right? So both traveling to see birds and looking at valuing backyard birds, as well as coastal recreation. And one of the things we need to recognize is that there's various threats that we've been facing across the world, but also in the US, that are of threats to birds. Things from wildfires, urbanization and land cover change, invasive species, and then also sea level rise and development, right? And so this is where there's many different facets that we need to kind of worry about, many different kind of problems that come up in terms of understanding how welfare is being impacted by these types of threats. So one of the things I really want to put forth is that the USDA Forest Service's mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. And I want you to remember this present and future generations part, because it's going to come up and matter when we talk about the total economic value and the different component parts. So then moving forward into the 2012 planning rule that's listed in the Federal Registry, if you'd like to read it in more detail, benefits people obtain from ecosystems, including, so you'll see that there's 4 categories: provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. And you see, like, for example, with provisioning services, we have clean air and water, fuel, storage, fiber, mineral, climate regulation, water filtration, purification and storage, soil stabilization, flood control, and disease regulation. We also need to think about things like supporting services, so pollination, seed dispersal, soil formation, and nutrient cycling. And then cultural services, we have the educational component, we have aesthetics, spiritual and cultural, heritage values, recreational experiences, and tourism opportunities. Right, so these are things that, again, come into play in terms of how the Forest Service thinks about things, and especially when we're thinking about trying to measure how we're going to categorize these values in terms of understanding ecosystem services. So when it comes to non-market valuation, why I call myself a non-market valuation economist is that I focus on using a collection of methods that are used specifically to value environmental goods and services that are not bought and sold in the marketplace, right? And so one of the things that's really key to what I do is I use information about choices. And these are choices that people make where environmental goods and services are complementary to what they're doing, right? So realize that people make decisions all the time, right? And we may not think much about some of these things and how they're complementary, right? But let's think about it. If we were to go boating somewhere, you'd want the water quality to be such that it would be at least meet the standard for safe for boating, right, under the Clean Water Act, right? So we can kind of think about there are these different metrics in terms of different qualities, and understanding that, okay, water quality being like swimmable is going to be a higher standard than that of being boating, right? Because again, in terms of contact. So we can think about these different things that come into play and how environmental quality, so getting back to these environmental goods and services, come into play in terms of that recreational decision, which is again going to be the focus of the latter half of our talk tonight. So then when I break things down into revealed and stated choices, what I want to bring into focus is the fact that there's going to be data on choices people actually made. And that's what I mean by revealed, because they actually made that choice. So they revealed to us that that was their preference. That was the best option to them. That was going to be the most satisfying at that point in time. We also have stated preference methods, which is when we're collecting information on future policy scenarios. And there are questions that we're asking. And we're asking people to make a choice that's best for them, right? So hence, since it's not a choice they're going to have to like actually make, it's a hypothetical choice, it becomes what we call a stated choice. Hence the term stated choices. And so again, if you remember Econ 101, economics is the study of choices, because after all, scarcity is a thing, and so you always have to make a choice between things. You always have to make a trade-off. You don't get to have everything, right? And so this is how then economics looks at this lens and helps us understand how we value things based on the choices, be they actual or hypothetical, to be able to understand how people value environmental goods and services, to include birds. And so this is the crazy chart of all the different methods that go into actually valuing the total like economic value. So you can see there's lots of different methods, right? And so this is where if I had to draw a circle about like what I actually do, I would say I do travel costs to include recreational site choice, which we'll learn about tonight. And I also have previously done stated preference, right? So we'll talk about this with a little bit later. But we start to realize that there's a lot of other different methods. And so this is why when you learn about non-market valuation economists, they might do other sorts of modeling, like say hedonic pricing. So this is where they're looking at then residential housing choices to be able to infer how people value environmental amenities about where they live based on where they chose to purchase a house. So again, you can start to see that when we talk about this total economic value, it's a big umbrella. And that's why I wanted to be very clear tonight that when we're talking about measuring this, I work on valuing a small subset, and that there's many different people like myself that focus on valuing environmental goods and services, but we all have different component parts that we work on valuing. And so with that, I think it's really important to then transition to thinking about, okay, rather than trying to think about all these different kind of models, because those names probably don't mean anything to you in terms of, okay, that's that kind of model. What does that mean? What does that translate to in plain English? Well, it means we can think about, we have direct use, indirect use, option value, existence, and bequest. And you'll see that these are actually grouped under specific subsets, right? So under use value, we can see that we have direct use and indirect use. And so we can see when we talk and refer to direct use, we're literally thinking about when people directly engage with the environmental good and service. When we think about cutting timber, right, so timber harvesting, or we think about people, so non-timber products could include things like mushrooms. We have mushroom harvesting in national forest lands, if you didn't know. So that's a thing. It also might help that now I'm out in Oregon, so this is more of a thing. We also have people that, right, it's well known people go hiking in national forests, right? So that's the thing. Again, people are directly engaging with the environmental good and using it. Whereas things like water filtration, carbon sinks, that's an indirect use because we all benefit from it, but doesn't mean we're actually directly engaging with it. And so you can start to see why there's this distinction between direct and indirect under the use value category. So then moving forward, we can think about, again, remember, think back to the mission statement of the USDA Forest Service. We talked about present and future generations. So again, we realize that some people aren't going to use it, like national forests or environmental goods and services, but they still like knowing they're there. I really like knowing that all the wilderness up in Alaska, even though I've never been to Alaska, are there, right? Because it's wonderful to know that. We also want to be there for future generations. So we think about the bequest value that comes into play. And then lastly, we have this option value. So this one is a little bit more difficult to place. And depending on the chart that you've seen, it may have been placed under use value. It may have been placed under non-use value. Since it is one of those things where it could literally become a use value, right? So technically it's a non-use value because people are not engaged with it, but they like having that option. So that's why I like to categorize it in between. And this is where with my close colleagues, we've kind of agreed that it's because it's not perfectly within use or non-use, that it is kind of just in between floating. And so we like to put it there in the middle. And so this is an adaptation I did of a chart that was out of a textbook that I've used to teach environmental economics to my students. Because again, I think it really helps place everything, right? Put into context, put into plain English what I do and what people like me do and how it all matters in terms of adding up. So again, when we talk about recreation, we're talking about direct use. So I want to redirect your attention to this box and realize that from here on out, we're really going to be talking about this small segment of the non-market valuation framework and toolkit. Since we're all here to talk about bird watching, like let's think about all the different ways we engage with the outdoors. So this is just a collection of things that I've done over time, and I hope it inspires you because I do know that we're all locked at home here, especially for you guys. You guys are dealing with snow, and well, we dealt with that last week. I don't think it makes it any better, but you know, it kind of reminds us that there are many cool things to see this is taken then at Red Rock, so I did some rock climbing out there. Right, and so you can see this is then out near Red Rocks. You have some areas here in the Cascades. This is at Crater Lake from a snowshoeing trip, right? And then this is Assateague, good old Assateague, right? So from the good of a birding opportunity to also seeing, of course, the well-known horses that you can see there at Assateague, right? So we all appreciate that, like there's lots of enjoyment, satisfaction that we get from going outdoors and participating in these recreational activities. And I really want you to hold on to that concept of satisfaction, because this is going to be a really important concept when we think about measuring benefits, as we need to measure them for benefit cost analysis, which is what is then the premise that a lot of policies, rules, and regulations are based on that benefit cost analysis. So we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what is the relevant benefit measure that we need to measure for that purpose. So you might wonder, like, okay, so how did this all get started? How did people think to use travel costs as a way to measure recreation and the value and the benefits? Well, it all actually dates back to 1947 that the National Park Service put out a call, and because they wanted to value U.S. national parks. So Harrod Hotelling responded and suggested they use the differential travel cost rates based on travel distance visitors traveled to reach a park. Right? So this was a premise of like, okay, you want to value the single site. People are revealing to you that they're spending at least as much money in order to have this recreational opportunity. That gives you a price where you don't actually have a price, right? Because again, they spent this bundle as a cost to be able to enjoy this recreational opportunity. And so, right, we have everything from the gas and food costs to your any fees that you incurred, to include entrance fees. These are things that you may not think of as a way to have a price, but again, people have revealed that they were willing to spend at least that much money to enjoy that opportunity, right? And so that's really what's putting into context. So then part of what this is also talking about is that we're looking at people coming from different origin zones, aka different zip codes. And this was a way that they could then organize having different people coming from different areas. And that was rather important at the time because, after all, they're trying to get a sense of like, oh, how do we value this and how do we do this in a systematic way? And so we think back to, again, principles of micro. We know that, okay, we have a downward sloping demand curve because as the price goes up, right, people's quantity demanded goes down. That's the law of demand. So when we think about what we have now, our quantity demanded is going to be the number of trips. We're going to go on our x-axis. And the travel cost per trip, because again, remember, economists like to think on the margin. And so this is why we're going to think about this in per trip. So this is where our cost is per trip here, all right, for our price here. And so then what it means when we have a point on our graph, it corresponds to the number of trips an individual from a given zip code made. So for example, my hypothetical scenario here, we have an individual that from their home, right, they chose to make 26 trips over the course of a year, and it cost them $47 per trip to take that trip to whatever place. Maybe it's Assateague. I don't know. I like Assateague a lot, right? And so then we can actually use information on the fact, of course, there's more than one person going to some place, right? And so we have all this variation that comes from the fact that people are coming from different origins, right? And so we can plot that. So then using statistical methods known as regression, we can actually estimate a best fitting line through these points to estimate a demand curve, right? And so that's what we end up doing, is that we estimate this demand curve. And you could go like, well, it doesn't perfectly go through this. Well, that's why we have an error term that accounts for the fact that, again, it's a best fitting line in terms of how it's going to fit the data. So then we have this information. We have a demand curve now for this site. And so one of the things we need to remember is that when we think about what's going on, we need to think about, okay, what are consumers getting out of this? Well, thinking back to Econ 101, we can think about this term called consumer surplus. And this is defined as a difference between what consumers would be willing to pay, and this is their maximum willingness to pay, and then what they actually paid. And that difference, like we all know that satisfaction of getting something on sale and being like, oh yeah, I would have paid this, but like I saved money. So think about that satisfaction. This is also why when I was thinking about the example with all the different places that I've done some recreation, I wanted you guys all to think about the satisfaction you enjoyed from those trips, right? Because you didn't necessarily pay your full willingness to pay to get to that location, right? To enjoy it. So in some sense, you have this demand curve, right? And you have the price you paid, and the difference between those two, right? That's your consumer surplus. So hence we get this idea of satisfaction above and beyond what you paid. This is the benefit measure we want to capture for the purpose of benefit cost analysis. This matters, right? Because we realize that A, consumer surplus is going to matter for and be different for different people, right? So does person 2 live closer or further from the site? Well, if we think back to our basics, we can go like, well, travel costs are lower for person 2, which means they live closer, which is probably why they took more trips, right? That we can deduce these things, right? And realize that, yeah, it's natural that someone that's going to live closer is going to take more trips, so travel costs are going to be lower. And if you have an aggregate demand curve, right, a market demand curve, that their slice of the consumer surplus is going to be larger by that fact. So one thing you may often see be published is information about what money is being spent related to a recreational activity. And this is what we call economic impact, because again, it's making an impact on our local communities, and that's a good thing. But we also have to recognize why we don't value that part in benefit cost analysis is that this is money that is being transferring hands, right, from the consumers to the producers, right? So we wouldn't want to double count this, right, because it becomes a net transfer. And so that's why we have to think about, really, when we are thinking about the relevant benefit measure that we want to capture is the consumer surplus. All right, so that's my little econ lesson for this evening, kind of thinking about what we're trying to capture when we're trying to value benefits from environmental goods and services for the purpose of benefit cost analysis, right? So then we talked about, okay, environmental quality, it changes. So let's say we have a restoration project and we've improved a site. So what's gonna happen is that we would expect, right, that people are gonna take more trips because the site's gonna be better, right? So maybe they've improved the habitat, and so now you're able to see more wildlife, more birds, and so people are going to take more trips, and that's going to lead to then an increase in consumer surplus here in this light blue, as well as an increase in economic impact, right? Obviously, right, so say there's something like an oil spill and people take fewer trips because this site is no longer as healthy, right? Things are degraded. Well, the demand curve is going to shift inwards, right, or downwards, because the site has gotten worse and people are going to then take fewer trips. Thus, we'll see a smaller amount of consumer surplus and a smaller economic impact, right? So these are how these things come together. So we can see all of that. So this is pretty cool. Like, we got things really figured out for how to value a single site. We all know there's lots of public land, lots of sites to go to. So how do we do that, right? That becomes the salient question, because we realize that to do the single site would take a lot of studies. So it turns out we have a technique that we have borrowed from the marketing literature that is about how do you model a choice to be able to understand the marginal values of the goods. And so now we're going to model the choice of where to go. And so rather than looking at the number of trips as our dependent variable, we're going to look at the choice to go to that particular site in the choice set. And so to put this all in context, my students, sorry, you guys are going to hear about cereal because my students like cereal over soda. So that is why we're talking about cereal as your example, not soda. So everybody needs to kind of wrap their head around this idea of a choice set, because it can kind of be a little bit abstract. What do we mean by a choice set? Well, think about the cereal aisle, right? It is a defined size and there are a defined number of options. Everyone on board, thumbs up, that we have a defined number of options here? Okay, so this is also what it comes into play about our choice set, right? We have a defined number of options of places we could go for our desired recreational activity. So hence, for any given activity, right, we're gonna have that. We're also going to realize that these sites, so our choices, so these sites in our choice set have different attributes. So when we think back to cereal, right, there are different types and they share some similarities, but they're also different, right? So we can think about granola and Raisin Bran, for example, right? They both might have raisins in them. They might also have other dried fruit. Maybe one's wheat, one's oat, right? Maybe they're even different brands. We can start to see how all of these are different attributes of the cereal, right? And again, so we could start to then break it down how to value the cereal, and it's based on its component parts, its attributes. So hence, I like this example because I think it helps put into context what can otherwise potentially be an abstract concept. And so one of the things I want to rehash before we move forward and go into some examples about some studies that I have done is kind of draw a comparison of these two methods, right? So realize both of these are used even today. Nowadays, we do see that the recreational site choice model is used more frequently because it allows you to value more sites at once. So we tend to see it used more, and it's often considered the workhorse within the recreational demand literature. And so we're seeing that in both models, right, travel cost is being captured as a proxy for the price of the environmental good. But again, we can see that the travel cost model itself tends to focus on a single site, and we're then looking at number of trips, right, is our dependent outcome, and then it's modeled as a function of price and other site attributes. Whereas our recreational site choice model, again, it's being modeled as a choice to go to that destination of all possible spots, right? And so for a given like regression, right, so for a given entry for a trip, you're going to have several rows, and there'll be zeros for all the sites you didn't choose to go, and there'll be one for the site you did choose to go to, right? And so then you'll have all the different attribute levels for all the different sites. And then again, we're going to use our regression methods to then be able to back out the marginal values of those site attributes. And that's going to allow us to then build, based on the attribute levels of each site, the value of each site within a single model. Pretty cool. I might be biased because this is what I do for work and I think it's really fun. So, you know, I understand that I might be biased. So then to put this into context related to bird watching is that we can start to think about, okay, we have to think about our choice sets regarding like, okay, if it's a day trip, obviously our choice set's going to be smaller than if it was an overnight trip, right? People stay closer to home when you're thinking just in terms of like for the day. Right, so that's always something to consider when you're looking at modeling this. You also need to think about, okay, what do you need to put into the model as site attributes for that recreational activity? Since we're talking about bird watching, well, obviously we should talk about some measure about bird species. And so in this case, maybe it's the number of expected species that you can see. We might also think about, okay, how is that site managed for biodiversity? Is it going to be in an urban or rural location? What kind of ecoregion is it? And so this image here that we have on the slide, right? This is a map of Oregon and Washington. So I'm actually down here nowadays. So this is where Portland, Oregon is. And there's different ecoregions. So from the Willamette Valley, right? You can see that that's going to be different than say the Coast Range. I've lost my mouse. There we go. Willamette Valley, Coast Range, you have the Cascades. Right, so again, there's all these different ecosystems that you want to capture and account for within your models, because we all know, having all been bird watching, that where you go, what kind of ecosystem you're in, it's going to then have an effect on what kind of birds you can expect to see. So that's going to matter. We also know that the cool thing about being a bird watcher is that, you know, with the season change, you get to see a new crop, if you will, a new subset of birds, because they always are changing with the seasons. Yay for getting to see migratory birds. So I know this is a prime time for waterfowl to be migrating through, or at least the start of it. So again, we can start to see these are the different kind of things that economists such as myself think about. And this is literally a list of what I thought about when I was looking to value bird biodiversity using eBird data. Right, and so this is going to bring me to this part where I want to, something that I am, I guess, the best well known for in my field is that I've been using citizen science data to value bird biodiversity. And so I do want to take a moment to kind of take a step back and say, okay, like when we're talking about citizen science data, we're talking about scientific work undertaken by members of the general public, often in collaboration with others or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions. In this case, with eBird, we're talking about the Lab of Ornithology up at Cornell. And they are a dedicated bunch. I actually had the really good fortune to go up to Cornell to give a talk at the beginning of March 2020, literally weeks before all this started. So that I got to go visit the Lab of O and tour it, and it was, oh my gosh, what an experience. I really encourage all of you that it's, as a bird watcher, it's worth the trip. And so one of the things that we've seen is that economists, we like having data because it allows us to do things like model what we're trying to model. One of the big things that had hampered a lot of efforts to value bird biodiversity historically was the absence of data, because, well, when you go bird watching, you don't necessarily have to have a fishing license or hunting permit like you do when you go fishing or hunting. So there's no record of who's going bird watching. With eBird, all of a sudden we had a record of people going and what they were seeing and all of that. And so this is where citizen science really enabled me and others to make a difference in terms of being like, now that we have data on this, we can actually work to model this to be able to back out values. And I guess in this initial context is to eBird members. We'll talk about making it representative later. That's something that I'm working on. But kind of at this first step, really doing this. There you go. So if you have not ever used eBird, I encourage you to check it out. It's a very neat platform. Also, it's funded by public dollars. So as a taxpayer, it's worth checking it out. It has a lot of cool features. It tells you more about species, exploring regions. And then from our perspective of think back to our cereal aisle, right? Their function, explore hotspots, helped me to find the different types of cereals, if you will, the different types of sites and places where people would go for bird watching. So we could also see how this information acted like a guidebook, right? Because back in, I know, pre-electronics, we had guidebooks that told us where to go for hiking, for camping, for bird watching, all this information. And so again, those are effectively our cereal aisles because they're telling us where to go, right? What are the good places that are, and they tell us also the site attributes of the site, right? What you can expect to see when. So again, you can see how this could make me all tingly inside and all very happy. So then going forward and then thinking about some of my work. So one of the first pieces, one of the first publications I had with this work was the article that was published back in 2017 in Ecological Economics, and it's titled "The Non-Market Value of Birding Sites and the Marginal Value of Additional Species, Biodiversity in a Random Utility Model of Site Choice by eBird Members." And what this goes on to do is figure out using trip data that was reported to eBird by eBird members between 2010 and 2012. Using that data, I was able to then estimate a recreational site choice model, which is more broadly known as a random utility maximization model. That's the RUM, which is just more commonly known for the choice literature, just in terms of choice modeling in general. So the big thing that came about was that we could estimate the average willingness to pay for a trip in our data set for these members, right? So estimating a demand curve. And also understand then what was the marginal willingness to pay for an additional species. All right, and this is what we found to be just over $3. And so one of the things that's a key element in terms of what we did is that we also showed how you could do this for different kinds of sites, right? So when you had endangered species present that you could expect to see, national wildlife refuges, national parks, national forests, and then sites that weren't managed for biodiversity. Right? So many lands, public lands, are actually managed specifically for some kind of biodiversity. National forests, national parks, national wildlife refuges all fit into that category. And one of the cool things is that I had never quite realized this until I was doing this research, is that national wildlife refuges are actually managed specifically for bird biodiversity. So it kind of is why in the model, it is actually distinctly different than national parks and national forests, right? So birders actually do recognize that this management is different and for their chosen activity. So that was kind of neat. We also understood that, okay, climate change and urbanization, so land cover change, is a real thing that's happening. So we need to understand how do these differences, how are they going to impact people? And so we teamed up with Chad Wesley from the Audubon Society to utilize his forecast to be able to infer how these welfare changes were happening. Again, this is all about eBird members. And so these values that we've estimated, they're not representative, right? So they're only applied to the eBird members. And so this is one of the things that we had to recognize, that this was going to be a limitation, but we could do a lot of illustrative work. And so we wanted to illustrate here that there were going to be gains and losses. So here, this heat map shows you that, so here we have A1 and A2. So this was for June, right? And so changes, this was a change from 2000 to 2020. And then this was for 2000 to 2050. And then this was with using the Christmas bird count data to do the forecast of, again, change from 2000 to 2020 and 2000 to 2050. You have to remember the trip data we're using was 2010 to 2012. So I know it's weird now being in 2021 and talking about this, but again, let's think about it was using historical data and using forecasts to understand how we're going to see these changes. And so these colors represented bird species richness forecast changes. And so we could see that there was going to be areas where, in some areas, we're going to actually see more species that are going to be expected to be seen than previously, than historically. And in some areas, the number of expected species was going to be lower. And so that was what was going to be the big driver then to our welfare effects. And I think this is an important thing to understand, is that these are what then are driving those welfare estimates, is that these are these differences that are happening. So when we talk about there being some people that were better off and some people that are worse off, it's because, as you can just see from the heat map showing the differences in expected species between these time periods, is that the effects wasn't uniform, or is not expected to be uniform, right, based on the forecast. So that's kind of the little, I guess, summary I wanted to give you guys of some of my past work that I'm most well known for. But I also wanted to talk to you all a little bit about my current projects. And one of the things you might have noticed me saying is that, well, these values that were estimated in these two previous studies were for eBird members, right? And they could not be used within benefit cost analysis for the purposes of policy, rules, or regulation making. Obviously, knowing that there's that much data out there and that it can't actually be used as is for policy making is really frustrating to a researcher like me, who knows that this is really a golden opportunity, right? And so hence, my co-author and I decided that, okay, well, there's got to be a way to understand the selection so that we can correct for that sample convenience factor, right? So that it would actually approximate then the general population. So this, again, we're going to do an exercise using our illustration here so we can put this all into context and wrap our head around this mechanism. So what we have here, right, when we think about statistics, we know that we have the whole general population, and that anytime we're looking at doing a statistical study, we like having a nice random sample, right? That has the best statistical properties and makes us all very happy-go-lucky. We also understand that there's going to be some set of the population that are bird watchers, right? We noticed that there was over 47 million bird watchers in the United States, at least back in 2016, right? We saw that. We also understand that some subset of bird watchers in the United States are going to be eBird members. So knowing that there's going to be some overlap, we're going to be able to use this overlap from our random sample of a survey, where we also did a survey of eBird members. We're going to use this random sample and use this overlay area where we have information on what proportion of the random sample are bird watchers, but also what proportion of the bird watchers in our random sample or eBird members, to model the sample selection, right? Because if we can correct for the non-randomness, right, so that basically goes back to having the data as if it were random, right, a random subset, that we can then correct it so that it is representative. And then we can use that gold mine of data that's provided by citizen science projects. This also has a very similar intuition for what you would do for social media. And so this is where I have one paper with Trudy Cameron. She's also the same co-author on my earlier eBird work, who's been conditionally accepted about modeling the market extent for a day trip using this technique. We have another paper that we're working on that's a recreational site choice model that we need to make some additional changes to before we submit it to a journal. So that's in progress. And then another paper with a different co-author of mine, but also known as someone that is my academic sibling, because we were both trained actually by Trudy and Cameron there at the University of Oregon. And we worked together with Nature Conservancy to look at willingness to pay for biodiversity protection across samples. We had a random sample of the population through an internet panel, as well as a sample of people who took the survey on social media platforms that the TNC manages. And so kind of, again, trying to show that, okay, there are all these different mediums through which we can collect data now that we previously didn't have access to, right? This is something that with our technology nowadays, it's enabled a lot, but we still have to think about what does it mean in terms of what can policymakers use. And so this has been something that's been a passion of mine, because I know that this data is valuable. And so making it then useful and making it representative has been something that's been a big part of my research agenda, so that this stuff could be useful in benefit cost analysis going forward for policymaking, rules, regulations. Where we're on time. Okay, we're getting a little close. So let me just kind of wrap up here pretty close. So one of those ongoing projects that is in your neck of the woods is actually funded through a Delaware Sea grant, and is, some of the PIs on it include Christopher, aka Kit Heckscher, he's over at Delaware State, as well as Mulai Tempurni, as well as Natasha Wetzel out of TNC there in Delaware. And so one of the things that we are looking at is this question of the importance of Delaware Bay nearshore habitats to migratory songbirds and the projected ecological and economic consequences of future sea level rise and urban development. We again understand that the eastern shore, Delaware, they're located on a pretty important spot along the Atlantic Flyway. And so we also understand with sea level rise, so this is using forecasts from work that was done by Copenal back in 2014 that was published to show how sea level is predicted to affect Delaware. So these were forecasts that were done out to 2100. In pink, you have here the coastal public land in Delaware. And then in light blue, these are the forecasts with 3 feet of sea level rise. And then the dark blue here is with 7 feet of sea level rise. So you can see that this is going to be a non-trivial factor for in terms of what available public lands is going to be. And so this is some ongoing work that I am doing with an undergraduate from Salisbury University, Kelsey Posel. And we're working on this actually right this semester, analyzing the data. So we presented this information to people to help them understand the forecast and then ask them how their trip behavior would change. So how many fewer trips they would take, given how much mass basically was going to be lost. And so since we're in the process of analyzing this for her honors thesis this spring, I can say stay tuned, because before you know it, she'll be up here presenting her work with me. So again, stay tuned. So again, I wanted to be respectful of all of your time. The work I do is part of the effort to do a full accounting of all benefits, market and non-market, which is quintessential to conducting policy, rule, and regulation analyses. We understand that without this, you don't have all the information. It's also important to understand how federal agencies view these, right? So this is where that 2012 planning rule influences how we see things. And this is where, for example, with the National Forest Service, I'm part of the National Ecosystem Services Strategic Team, right, NEST, because again, we're focused on understanding these ecosystem services and realizing that, again, none of us can do it all, but we each have our component part that we cover and contribute in terms of these analyses. I also just want to leave you all with the whole fact that, like, right, we all understand birds are important, not only for our personal enjoyment as bird watchers, but also for the fact that they provide a lot of important ecosystems services. So with that, I want to just go with that, because it is 49 after, and so I feel like I've gone over time, so in an effort to be respectful. Thank you all for your time. I do welcome your questions and comments, and again, thank you all for the invitation to come talk to you this evening.
Well, thank you for that really, to me at least, very interesting presentation. I kind of like to get into the details of stuff like that, which is really, really fun. We do have time for questions, if anybody would have questions. And Dr. Kolstoe, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can get everybody on there. All right, there we go. So yeah, does anybody have questions right off that you want to ask?
Yeah, I actually have a question. Yesterday, my husband and I were at Beverly Triton. It's a county park. And in just a couple of years we've been going, we've seen that the place is going underwater. You know, you can barely navigate the trails anymore. They're all underwater. And yeah, they're building platforms, but I think without putting like really major money into this park, that it's not going to be a viable place to visit very soon. So I'm wondering, like, would the county like look at your kind of data and measure that to decide whether or not to even keep putting money into this place, or, you know, that's my question. Like, how do you take the kind of data that you have and measure it against
investment by
the investment by the county?
Hiring rangers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is where you have to look at all the alternatives, right? So either they build and there's continued recreational opportunities, right? So that's one scenario that you would do a benefit cost analysis on. The other is okay, so they don't do anything and there's going to be foregone recreational opportunities, right? As well as potential loss of other ecosystem services, right? And so that's kind of really then the equation that they're looking at. And there might be a third alternative, right? But these are what they're going to consider then is that they can make the investment and continue to provide these kind of recreational opportunities, or, right, if they do not do that and so it's no longer accessible and people take fewer trips, right? So this idea that these recreational opportunities are no longer as good as they used to be, so people just don't go there as frequently as a result. Right, we can see that there's going to be a loss of benefits from that. They just have to make a decision and through, I would hope, analysis, right, to make it so that it's data driven to come to that conclusion based on using data. And so this is where often analyses done at that level will use aggregate data. So they'll do what we call a meta-analysis to be able to determine these values when they're not able to do a primary study for that specific scenario, right? And so that's how they'll be able to compute the estimated value for the purpose of that particular site or policy in question to make that determination using data.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have you looked at similar type of scenarios at, say, Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge? You know, National Wildlife Refuge, obviously federal property. They're looking at sea level rise impacting things quite severely there as well. And so I don't know if some of the work that you were doing analyzing data for forests and refuges and things of that, you know, how extensive is your research on federal properties, say on the Eastern Shore in Delaware?
Yeah, so this is where the work for the Delaware Sea Grant, I think, is going to be the most salient to this because, again, we're talking about the same region and also being impacted in a similar way. And so how we set up the data collection with being able to understand how the trip data looked for going to different zones along the coast, because some people don't quite make the distinction of, say, one site to the other because they're right next to each other. Right, so that you could literally technically be in one site if you cross the road, and so kind of we looked at trips to different zones, and then when we did that follow-up question, we did when we showed the marshes, right, in terms of showing different levels of sea level rise. What we were asking then is what is called a contingent behavior question. So it's the contingent on this happening, so this amount of land now being inundated with water, right? So you have, again, the area that's usable to you is going to be reduced. Like how many fewer trips would you take, right? So kind of trying to get a sense that, okay, people are going to take fewer trips to some extent. How drastic is that extent going to be, right? So trying to really understand their behavior, so hence the name contingent behavior. So the work that Kelsey is doing with me for her honors thesis is us looking at, okay, we have people's trip behavior for 2019 and 2020, and we gathered 2019 data in addition to 2020 data, because, well, we all know 2020 was an unusual year, right? So in terms of trying to understand historical behavior, 2020 was not necessarily representative of how people usually go out and enjoy recreational lands, coastal public lands. And so we gathered trip data on both 2019 and 2020, and then asked those contingent behavior questions so we could get a sense of how people would respond. And so that is something that could go into a meta-analysis that could be used, because again, it would be similar. So that's why that kind of analysis would be appropriate to then take into account, especially like, say, Blackwater, because then we understand that, okay, they're undergoing similar things, that they're seeing a reduction in size, right? There's just not as much public land that's going to be available due to sea level rise and coastal erosion. So then knowing that people are taking fewer trips as a result, and that there's this loss of welfare, how do then the policymakers decide to respond? And really that becomes a policymaker decision about how do they want to best proceed. All right, do they want to see about purchasing additional lands? Both Delaware and Maryland, for example, they have open space programs that allow them to make those purchases to add land to the public portfolio and then make improvements so that it's well suited for recreational pursuits. So that is an option that's available to them and existing programs that they could do that through. So that it becomes one of those things where they have to make that decision, and the work that I do, it just provides them with the information to make the kind of an educated decision about what to do, right? Because as we know, there's always going to be a issue of scarce public dollars, right? There's never enough money to do every single project people would like their public entities to do. So then what's going to be then kind of this maximization of getting the biggest bang for your buck in terms of benefits for the cost. It's really the premise behind benefit cost analysis, is this idea of understanding, okay, we have to make trade-offs, so how can we get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of the decisions we make?
So, and you said stay tuned for updates on the project later. How might we find out when that is
So the Delaware
available?
Sea Grant Office will be posting updates. So this is part of our work with, because it is funded through a Delaware Sea Grant, they want people to know what we're finding. So they will be sharing it with everybody as it becomes available. So that is kind of the nice thing about working with the Sea Grant Agency, is that they have a vested interest in helping the public know what the research dollars is helping to know. And so they'll share that using their social media channels. So hence, I really do mean stay tuned, because it will be coming out and it will be made known. So that's, it's one of those things where I know Kelsey's been really enjoying the project as well, because it puts a lot of the theory that she's learned in class right into practice. I think it's one of the things that I enjoy about giving public talks. So I really hope you didn't mind me getting into the nitty gritty about, so these are how the models work and how we walk and talk, and hopefully you like the cereal aisle as well as my students did back in the day.
That was a good example. I like that.
Good.
One of the problems that natural resources economists face is scaling up and dealing with the hardcore economists. I mean, I worked at the World Bank with people like Joseph Stiglitz, and it was always a battle with mainstream economists, quite frankly, to use the models that you have to persuade people non-market values had a place in the scheme of things. How do you see your work affecting policy at a macro level? I mean, what you're doing is very persuasive, etc. It's intellectually rigorous, but how can you engage the policy domain?
Well, that I think is a multi-step process. I think part of it is through identifying important research questions, right? Because after all, there are things, this is where I remember when I started looking at valuing bird biodiversity in my eBird work, one of the things that helped convince a labor economist that maybe caring about birds mattered is that the 2011 US Fishing, Hunting, Wildlife Watching Survey showed that 1/3%, so like we're talking 0.33% of GDP was actually was wildlife expenditures. And he's like, really? That's how much people spend to go do that stuff? And I was like, so this is where, again, while we may not use those economic impact measures for benefit cost analysis in terms of, because again, we don't want to double count, we can see that people are spending real money on this, right? And it's having real impacts on local economies. And so that's where, from a recreation standpoint, we can get people to care, because people realize that they're like, oh, this is actually like not small potatoes. We're like, no, you might think of it as small within your specific example, but when you actually think about it as a whole, it turns out to be pretty large. And for example, with the national forests, we understand that most people engage with national forests through recreational opportunities. They don't really necessarily think about the timber harvest, mushroom harvesting, things like that. They really think about, oh, like there are these forests, they provide these lovely services like being a carbon sink when we're thinking about climate change, or thinking about the fact that if you want to go camping or hiking in them, right, there are these wonderful opportunities to go enjoy nature. Like honestly, that most people think about national forests and think about recreation or wildlife within them, the habitat they provide, not necessarily the extractive part, even though traditionally that was a very important component of national forests, was the kind of the extractive use part of national forests. So this is where, again, we see things fluctuate over time in terms of where people's attention are drawn. And so we can start to see that while recreation is just one small component, right, of that total economic value of environmental goods and services, and that's why I showed you all the table, the chart, and the figure. There you go, figure, showing you the different components, is because when you can convince somebody that like a third of a percent is just kind of people spending money to go recreate, and that's just a small little component, they start to take a step back and go like, oh, so this total economic value that's all from environmental goods and services can get to be quite large, right? And so I think it's putting it into context and giving people a reference point about, okay, you're focused on this very small part, but let's take a step back, especially if you want to think about things from the macro level, right? That we can't just think about things at the micro or even kind of microscopic. If you're really thinking about the world economy, you have to put things into context and use a relevant frame of reference. And so I think that's a really important part, that we each play a role. And so that's also why I showed you all the chart of all the different methods that are used to value the total economic value of environmental goods and services, and say like, I value stuff using these methods, so these small little component parts. I don't do everything, right? But the components I do, I still think are important. So it comes back to the fact that it takes a team to complete things.
Yes.
One of the things that I like to use when I give talks is looking at, it's actually the 2011 survey, because apparently they only did state level analyses they do that like every 10 years, not every survey. So the last state level data for Maryland we have is from 2011, but back even then, which, you figure that's now 10 years ago, what they call the total industrial output was for wildlife watching, which they broke out as primarily bird watching, was $900 million just in the state of Maryland. And it added, what was that? The equivalent of like 33,000 jobs or 13,000. I don't know. It was kind of a surprising number of jobs. And those type of data really open people's eyes to the value of it's the activity as opposed to where it's being done. But you can sort of then take that and say, well, a lot of it's being done either on the shore or for forest birds, that kind of thing. So any opportunity we have to get that type of data broken out kind of at the state level is very effective for us in being able to communicate that to the public, which then, also to policymakers with that. So I hope you can do a lot to help other people understand this is very valuable, this type of work. Inspire those Salisbury kids to do a lot of studies with Maryland. That would be great for us.
Yeah, well, this is where eventually I'll finish the analysis with, there's a backyard bird study that I'm doing with Trudy that is valuing backyard birds in the Chesapeake Bay region, so to include Maryland. So that's actually coming down the pipeline.
Good, excellent.
But since that was a different set of techniques because it falls under more the stated preference due to time constraints, I did not feature it in tonight's presentation.
Yeah. Any other last
minute
questions?
You talked about how your piece is a small piece of the bigger pie. What organizations have you found that you've been working with that can pull together these various components?
So this is where, for example, I have, I guess, newer collaborations with people from Cornell. And so, for example, they have people that work more on the market-based side, that they have recently been awarded a grant to look at the value of the CRP program, so Conservation Reserve Program, and looking at birds. So understanding that there are, again, different groups that are working on stuff. Also, if you saw, there was a paper, an NBER working paper that I mentioned during that presentation that was looking at air quality and using birds as a proxy for that. So that co-authoring team did that. And so right now we're getting ready to talk about extensions, and then me working with their grad students to help them train them in the methods that that I've developed to use the eBird data so that they can, so more people can do those kind of studies. So this is where, again, we all have these different toolkits, if you will, and we also train people to, again, continue the effort, because we realize it's never one person, right? And you always want to mentor the next generation within your field. So that's something that I think is also an important part that's not often discussed, is the fact that it's an important thing to also train the next generation going forward, right? Because again, when we do things at a kind of a broad level, sometimes you miss some of the key details that are more on a local level, right? And so that's where you see that economists are found at all different levels with all different kinds of educational backgrounds. So those who tend to do primary studies tend to be those with PhDs like myself, but we also know that there are plenty of students that have bachelors and masters that do important work at local levels and state levels, even within the federal government. So we have our information specialists that work with us to help us with our analyses in the National Forest Service, for example, in my station, and they both have master's degrees. And so realizing that they get great training. Some of them didn't even just choose to go on to pursue their own PhD. Some of them really like being that collaborative effort. So it becomes, I feel like I'm not quite answering your question, but I hope this maybe inspires you that we all do actually talk to one another at conferences and workshops. And if you want to go look up something called the W4133, it's actually a subgroup that actually focuses on public and private lands. And so you can see that there's many different people from all different universities, especially land grants, that actually focus on these kind of techniques. And so I know that in a few weeks, we'll have a subgroup that will have that workshop for our subfield, and we'll present ongoing work and get feedback. And that's part of this process of where, even though I don't do, say, market-based techniques or hedonics, right? I know people that do. And so this is where understanding how all our studies fit together, and also get sometimes inspire ideas of things that haven't been done to help improve the techniques, right? And so this is where research really is, I think, a collaborative effort, because we all want to make the research better, because then everyone benefits when the research is better. Yes.
So are you saying that there's an army of economists out there that are bird watcher friendly, or looking at the data with regards to the economics of bird watching, your birders?
Yeah, there's more than just myself. Actually, so John Loomis, he's a professor emeritus. He's worked with Ducks Unlimited to do some work. So he's done more work with kind of waterfowl, if you will. There's also work, so some of the studies I cited during the Maryland Bird Day Live back in October, I think it was with, so we had Kathy Kling, Ivan Retnick, and Eric Zhao, or so some of those. So Eric is actually at the University of Oregon. Dr. Kathy Kling and Dr. Ivan Retnick are actually at Cornell University. And then, so of course, also working with Dr. Ali Johnston and Dr. Amanda Wadwell, which are on the natural science side of things. So it's actually, I think it's another important thing people don't often realize, is that economists, we often work with the natural scientists to understand things, right? That we all know our discipline, but we also know that we have our piece, right? And we need the pieces sometimes from the natural scientists to fit into our models, right? So for example, like when you saw the forecast, right, those are pieces that fed into the models I estimate, but they came from the work that like Chad did, Dr. Wellesley with the Audubon scientist did on those forecasts about bird range changes, right? So again, I don't think people often realize how much people actually collaborate across disciplines, right? So that when it's not just economists working with each other, but we also work with other disciplines so that we can understand how natural systems feed into our natural systems, right? Because natural and economic systems, they're intertwined. They're not separate. They're
Right.
intertwined.
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
I just looked up that W4133. Wow.
Yeah, that's what
I
I
have
was saying.
some reading to do to really get up to speed. That looks really interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So it may not be maybe as many people you would hope, but there's a lot of us out there that do this kind of work. And I know all the people that I've met that we're all really passionate about what we do and wanting to do the best science possible, right? To make the studies the best that they can be. And this is where, again, one of the things you'll notice in any field is, right, the techniques are always improving, right? And so that's kind of a fun thing to also be a part is pushing the boundaries of the techniques to improve them so that future studies are going to be that much better.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great.
Thank you for the work that you do, because it's exceedingly important.
Thanks.
And thanks for sharing that with us tonight. And I'll try to keep tabs with the Delaware Sea Grant on publications that they release related to this stuff.
Yeah, so again, this is where really, so Maryland also has a Sea Grant program. So all the states that are coastal, including the Great Lakes, have a Sea Grant program, and they do regularly publish research on their social media pages about what the projects that are being funded through these Sea Grant programs. So if you're ever kind of curious about what's going on, you can look those up and see what's being worked on. And again, so for example, that Delaware Sea Grant, it funded Aya Pickett, so she's a master's student at Delaware State, and then Kelsey Posel, an undergrad at Salisbury University for the project. So it's also one of those where there are also great training opportunities to help us train the next generation. So again, things that people may not often see, they just see the research, but it's also a wonderful teaching opportunity.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm wondering if your work that's being done on the backyard bird sort of quantification might be finished and available for a talk in the fall.
I hate to tell you this, but the lag is usually like a year to 2 years, and this is stuff. So next year, can we talk next year?
We would look forward to it, because I think that would be a really interesting to hear the results from that work as well.
Yeah, so and that would be great, because this is, again, exactly the kind of audience who I'd love to share the work with, because it really was inspired by my time at Salisbury, that this is where hence the data and all that experience of being there on the Eastern Shore and getting to enjoy all that the Eastern Shore had to offer. I mean, I still remember getting out. How many of you know Tom Horton by any chance?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so he took me out to see like the tundra swans when they were migrating one winter, and it was just spectacular, right? That you just see all these tundra swans, and especially it was one of those mornings where it was really frosty, and so the ponds were like half frozen, but you could see the skid marks of where they had been. And so it's just one of those things where, again, it's Eastern Shore was different than where I grew up, right? Because I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. But again, it's one of those things that being there did inspire that backyard bird study. And so I do look forward to sharing it with all of you, because I know you care very much about the birds of the Chesapeake Bay region.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation and sticking around to answer our questions.
Of
And now that
course.
you're in Portland, do you know about Chapman Elementary School and the Vox's Swifts?
I do not, but I'm taking a note here.
You better get out to see that in the fall, September. It's a big community event every night. So there's this huge chimney at Chapman Elementary School, and I forget which side of Portland it's on, but I'm sure you'll find it easily. And the hillside is lined with people, families. They have the blanket and the picnic and all that. They make it an evening. And there's, I don't know how many thousand, I think 10, 12,000 perhaps, Vox's Swifts that swirl around. And then at one time, they just start going down right at dusk.
Yeah.
Quite a spectacle. And in terms of the economic impacts of a bird, in the community, that would be a really interesting study, I think, because
Yeah.
it's just so many non-birders that go there just to see the spectacle of it. So
No. Well, I always
sure you
think
get
it's
there to
funny.
see that.
Will do. That people like that, they say, like, well, I'm not a birder. You're like, really? You're watching the birds. So what does that mean?
Right.
Like, isn't that default make you a bird watcher if you're watching the birds?
Yeah, tomato, tomato.
Exactly. But again, this is where thank you all so much for having me out tonight, virtually, I guess.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure, and I do hope you reach back out for updates on my ongoing projects. Again, I really do a lot of work on valuing bird biodiversity, and so I would welcome the opportunity to share it with all of you when there is more to share, I guess, because this is, again, where these analyses, to do them thoroughly, it takes time.
Well, Pamela certainly knows how to get in touch with you, so
She
I'm
does. She
sure
has
she
both
will
email
be tapping in.
addresses.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
excellent. So thank you
And
once
so,
again, and best of luck out there.
thank you.
Keep up the fantastic work
Yes.
y'all are doing out there.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I encourage you to, if you want to go look at the Pacific Northwest Station's website about what we do, we have 5 different programs, including the good services and values. And you can start to see really some of the things that researchers focus on within the Forest Service. So it's actually much broader than you might otherwise think. And so I encourage you, if you're interested, to take the time to go explore it. My colleagues are doing a lot of good work here.
Make it one of those best kept secrets. We'll try to let people know that these resources are out there.
Because again, we're doing this for the public good, right? That's why we do what we do.
Yeah. Well, make sure you put me in touch with whoever I need to communicate with
I will do
about
that.
trying to get this video posted, presentation
Will do.
posted. And thank you again. We look forward to the next time.
Sounds good, Chris. Thanks again to both
All
Chris
right.
and Pamela for the invitation. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.